1991, southern Iraq. The desert sky trembled with gunfire. Tracer rounds arced upward in red streams as hundreds of Soviet-built anti-aircraft guns unleashed everything they had. The Iraqis called it the Steel Dome, a curtain of cannon fire and missile plumes meant to destroy anything that flew below 10,000 feet. Flying straight into it were two American A-10 Thunderbolt IIs. They weren't sleek, they weren't fast, but they were heading directly into the most heavily defended sector of the Kuwaiti theater, at treetop level. On the ground, Iraqi crews operating ZSU-23-4 Shilkas and radar-guided S-60 batteries were confident. These weapons had been designed with Soviet doctrine in mind. Layered firepower meant to vaporize low-flying targets. Aircraft that flew below the radar died here. But something was different. The A-10s took hits, dozens. 23mm shells tore through tail sections. Flares burst against the desert sun. Shrapnel sliced into wing roots and fuselage. Yet the aircraft kept flying, not just surviving, but continuing their attack runs with mechanical calm. Below them, an armored column was torn to shreds. The GAU-8 Avenger, the A-10's 30mm cannon, roared like a chainsaw made of thunder. Its shells tore through T-72's BMPs and fuel trucks with methodical violence. One jet flew with smoke trailing from its engine, one hydraulic system gone, one gear door sheared off. But it kept going. An hour later, they returned to base. Photographers rushed to document the damage. Missing panels, shredded wings, engines limping on residual thrust. One mechanic said, "This plane shouldn't be flying. It should be in pieces." A few days later, Soviet military advisors stationed in Baghdad were shown gun camera footage captured by the Americans. At first, they thought it was a fake. Then they saw the damage reports, the photos, the recovered flight recorders. It wasn't just one aircraft. It was a pattern. The A-10 was surviving direct hits from systems that had been designed to destroy anything in the sky. This wasn't just a tactical anomaly. It was a doctrinal crisis. Because the weapons the Soviets had exported for decades, their pride, their proof of air dominance, had just failed. And they had failed against a plane the Americans jokingly called the Warthog. That wasn't funny anymore. For decades, the Soviet Union had prided itself on building the densest, most lethal integrated air defense systems on Earth. It was the ultimate insurance policy against Western air power, an intricate mesh of radar, anti-aircraft artillery, and surface-to-air missiles designed to render low-level flight impossible. From Berlin to Baghdad, Soviet advisors repeated the same mantra. Nothing survives in the envelope below 10,000 feet. They weren't guessing. They had math, doctrine, and weapons to back it up. The ZSU-23-4 Shilka was the crown jewel of Soviet gun-based air defense. With 4 23mm autocannons and radar-guided tracking, it could fill the sky with fire at over 3,400 rounds per minute. One Shilka was dangerous, a battalion of them, deadly. And that was just the first layer. Behind the guns stood missiles, SA-8 Gecko mobile launchers, SA-6 gainful radar-guided systems, and man-portable Igla and Strela launchers, heat-seeking death designed to strike anything that dared loiter low. This was the system exported to Iraq. By 1991, Saddam's forces had over 6,000 anti-air guns and launchers, most of them Soviet-built. Soviet generals believed that this would be the final test of their doctrines. Instructors embedded with Iraqi divisions had spent years training crews, calibrating radars, refining fire control systems. They expected the Americans to fly high, drop bombs from safe altitudes, and avoid the low-level kill zone entirely. And they certainly did not expect the U.S. to send in slow-moving, heavily armored attack aircraft, designed for close air support, into the most heavily defended zones on the map. The A-10's radar cross-section was massive. Its top speed was subsonic. And it was deliberately designed to fly low, slow, and directly at enemy armor. From the Soviet perspective, that was suicide. No Western aircraft could survive in a true anti-air environment, not against radar-guided guns, Not against Soviet-made SAMs, not at 300 knots and 300 feet. But that assumption wasn't just wrong. It was about to be shattered. Because the A-10 hadn't been designed to avoid Soviet systems. It had been designed to outlast them. Its wings were reinforced. Its cockpit surrounded by a titanium bathtub. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing. Its electronics were triple redundant. Even if one system failed, or even two, the aircraft kept flying. And when it got hit, it didn't eject, it turned. It came back, it fired. What Soviet generals believed was an obvious kill zone was about to become a kill zone for their tanks instead. The wrong assumptions had been loaded into every model, every drill, every export briefing. But in the sands of southern Iraq, the reality was burning, and the Warthogs were still flying. Soviet air defense doctrine was built on a few cold, precise truths. High-speed jets should fly above the effective range of guns. Helicopters operated close to the ground, but always with terrain masking. And anything flying in the middle between 500 and 10,000 feet was considered dead airspace. No man's land. The engagement envelope. It was here that Soviet systems thrived. From the ZSU-23-4 to the SA-8, the entire architecture of Soviet short-range air defense was constructed to annihilate targets within that vulnerable corridor. Radar would acquire, guns would track, and layered firepower would saturate the air with metal. No aircraft could survive prolonged exposure. Or so they thought. This doctrine had worked. In Vietnam, Soviet-built guns had shredded hundreds of U.S. aircraft. In the Arab-Israeli wars, Egyptian and Syrian units armed with SA-6s and Shilkas had bled the Israeli Air Force. The logic seemed airtight. Create so much threat at low altitude that Western aircraft would be forced higher, into the waiting arms of long-range missiles. But by 1991, the Americans had rewritten the playbook. And the A-10 wasn't just a tactical anomaly, it was a doctrinal contradiction. Instead of avoiding the engagement envelope, the A-10 thrived in it. Instead of minimizing exposure, it lingered. Instead of avoiding gunfire, it invited it, because the aircraft could take the punishment and still deliver kills. This flew in the face of every Soviet training manual. The A-10 had no afterburner. It couldn't outrun missiles. It couldn't jam radar the way an F-4G Wild Weasel could. But it didn't need to. It was armored. It was redundant. And most importantly, it had the GAU-8 Avenger. This 30mm 7-barrel Gatling cannon was not just an add-on. The plane was designed around it. Weighing over 4,000 pounds and firing depleted uranium shells at 3,900 rounds per minute, the GAU-8 was capable of chewing through tank armor like paper. Soviet-designed T-55s, T-62s, even later T-72s, all fell in seconds. The doctrine that had been so effective in Eastern Europe and Vietnam hadn't anticipated an aircraft like this, one that absorbed hits, delivered precise firepower, and flew multiple sorties per day. It wasn't just a flaw in tactics, it was a flaw in philosophy. Soviet air defense was reactive, designed to respond with overwhelming force. But the A-10 wasn't a typical threat. It was a purpose-built attacker, optimized to dive into Soviet-inspired kill zones and come out with smoke in its teeth. Iraqi crews trained by Soviet advisors tried everything: converging fire, radar-guided salvos, ambushes. Nothing worked. They weren't facing a mistake in American planning. They were facing the very aircraft the Soviets never thought would be built. A plane that did exactly what their doctrine said should be impossible. And it was only just beginning. January 19th, 1991. Southern Iraq. Just 2 days after the air campaign began, an A-10 pilot with the 23rd Tactical Fighter Wing made history, and no one in Moscow could believe the after-action report. The pilot's mission was straightforward: destroy armored vehicles and mobile artillery along the Kuwaiti border near al-Basra. Intelligence had identified a massing of Iraqi forces, including T-72s and BM-21 Grad rocket launchers. It was a textbook interdiction strike. But the route into the target zone was anything but routine. It meant flying low over terrain littered with Soviet-made air defense systems, ZSU-23 4 Shilkas, SA-9 Gaskin missile launchers, and old but still lethal S-60 57mm guns. The area was considered a no-fly box, where even fast jets risked being downed. The A-10 flew straight into it. Within seconds of crossing into hostile territory, the Shilkas opened up. Radar-aimed fire sliced through the air. 23mm shells stitched the sky. A nearby SA-9 locked on and launched. The pilot dropped flares, dipped, and kept moving forward. Then came the impossible. A round smashed through the right wing root. Hydraulic pressure dropped. Warning lights lit the cockpit. The aircraft's right aileron seized. The A-10 rolled, hard. Any other jet would have gone down in flames. But not the Warthog. The pilot switched to manual reversion, an emergency backup control system that relied on cables instead of hydraulics. The plane stabilized. He pulled up, turned back toward the target zone, and began his attack run. The GAU-8 Avenger spun to life. In a 5-second burst, he obliterated a column of T-72s. Each 30mm shell tore into engine decks, turret rings, and fuel lines. Secondary explosions filled the sky. A mobile radar vehicle disintegrated under the next strafing pass. On the return trip, 2 more SAMs launched. The first missed. The second hit. Shrapnel tore through the tail section. The jet yawed violently, leaking hydraulic fluid, trailing smoke. Still, it kept flying. The A-10 limped back across the Saudi border. Emergency crews met it on the tarmac. Photos taken minutes later showed a gaping hole in the fuselage, a shredded control surface, and blood on the cockpit glass from shrapnel that had cut across the pilot's helmet. But the plane had landed, and the pilot walked away. When the footage and damage assessment were shared with intelligence officers in Baghdad, some of whom were former Soviet military liaisons, they stared in disbelief. They asked to see the data again, then again. They couldn't process it. This wasn't a fluke. This was a platform designed to survive their entire doctrine. Reports began to flow upward, from field units, from radar crews, from captured footage. The Iraqi army had used Soviet guns, Soviet missiles, Soviet radars, exactly as they had been trained. And the A-10s didn't just survive. They won. This was the first impossible event. A jet that shouldn't have made it home did, not by miracle, but by design. And for Soviet air defense, the nightmare was only beginning. When the first reports reached Moscow, they were dismissed out of hand. An American aircraft had survived multiple direct hits from Soviet-made air defenses? Unlikely. It had flown into layered Shilka and SA-8 coverage and returned with confirmed kills. Impossible. At GRU headquarters, the initial reaction was skepticism, possibly a planted disinformation campaign, or worse, a fabrication by overzealous Pentagon officials. After all, Western media had every incentive to exaggerate Van, but the footage kept coming. Gun camera reels, damage assessments, photographs of warthogs peppered with holes, trailing hydraulic fluid, with entire control surfaces missing, but intact and operational. One particularly damning image showed an A-10 with its tail nearly severed, the vertical stabilizer hanging like torn aluminum foil. The Kremlin had seen combat footage before. But this was different. It wasn't propaganda. It was evidence of a failure of their exported systems to do what they were designed for. Still, the denial held. At an internal Air Defense Forces briefing, a general snapped, "This is not possible. A jet that slow is a target, not a survivor." His deputy countered, "And yet they are coming back." Soviet advisors embedded with Iraqi air defense units began transmitting their own assessments. They confirmed that Shilkas had hit targets, that radar locks had been successful, that missile systems had performed as trained. The problem wasn't Iraqi incompetence, it was American resilience. To break the deadlock, Soviet analysts at the Zhukovsky Air and Space Research Center initiated a full threat reassessment. They gathered telemetry, intercepted NATO communications, and even attempted to model the A-10's survivability based on limited specs. What they discovered was chilling. The A-10 was not built like a standard aircraft. Its titanium bathtub protected the pilot from direct cannon hits. Its dual engines were spaced far apart to prevent both from being destroyed in one strike. The fuel tanks were inerted, the electrical systems redundant, and the flight controls backed by manual overrides. Worse, the aircraft had no need to turn quickly and retreat. It could loiter. It could orbit a battlefield for hours, attacking again and again. This wasn't a reconnaissance plane. It was a predator designed to fly through Soviet fire and shoot back. The psychological toll began to rise. Field commanders who had spent years writing manuals on air denial were suddenly staring at an aircraft that made those doctrines obsolete. One report from an Iraqi division commander, translated and shared among Soviet officers, simply stated, "We shot everything at it. It kept killing tanks." In war, perception shapes fear. And by February 1991, the A-10 had become a symbol, not of American arrogance, but of invulnerability. And for Soviet generals who had built their careers on the strength of their air defense network, that was terrifying. They weren't just watching their systems fail, they were watching their legacy unravel. In the closed conference rooms of the Soviet General Staff, the disbelief mutated into a theory, a wrong one but plausible enough to cling to. The A-10 must be shielded. Electronic warfare. That was the explanation. The Americans had developed new jamming technology capable of blinding fire control radars, spoofing missile locks, and confusing radar-guided guns. That would explain why so many ZSU-23-4s and SA-8s failed to hit their targets despite clean radar tracking. It had to be the jammers. GRU analysts began scouring satellite imagery and intercepted signals for signs of EA-6B prowlers or EF-111 Ravens operating in tandem with A-10 sorties. If those were in the area, perhaps the Americans were masking the Warthogs with complex electromagnetic interference, a classic CAD, suppression of enemy air defenses tactic. But the data didn't fit. The jamming signatures didn't match up with the A-10 flight paths. And even when no known electronic warfare aircraft were in the area, A-10s were still surviving. Next came another angle. Perhaps the A-10s were receiving real-time targeting data from AWACS platforms or satellites, allowing them to avoid zones of high-concentration anti-aircraft fire. Wrong again. Intercepted pilot comms painted a different picture. The Warthogs were flying directly into known concentrations of armor and air defenses, not avoiding them. One pilot even requested re-entry into a hot zone after confirming tank kills on his first pass. These were not evasion tactics. They were direct assaults. That left a final and increasingly desperate explanation: stealth. Perhaps the A-10s had been retrofitted with radar-absorbing paint or materials, reducing their signatures to the point where Soviet radar couldn't track them accurately. The U.S. had already introduced the F-117 Nighthawk. Perhaps a stealth variant of the A-10 was in operation. But this theory quickly unraveled. The A-10 had a massive radar cross-section, by necessity. Its wings were broad and thick. Its fuselage was built for survivability, not radar evasion. Its cannon alone protruded from the nose like a steel fist, far too large to hide. The idea of a stealth A-10 was absurd. Still, the Soviet General Staff had no better answers. They were trapped in a mental loop, trying to explain survivability through the lens of avoidance, when the truth was far worse. The A-10 didn't survive by avoiding fire, it survived by enduring it. And that was something the Soviet system was never designed to confront, because Soviet doctrine had assumed that survival required speed, altitude, or invisibility. The A-10 disproved all three. It didn't fly fast, it didn't fly high, and it didn't hide. It just refused to die. And that meant the Soviet Union's proudest anti-air systems, ZSU-23-4s, SA-8s, S-60s, were being defeated not by technology, but by titanium and attitude. And in Baghdad, where Soviet advisors now watched the war unfold on CNN, the realization was creeping in. They weren't facing the wrong weapon. They were trapped in the wrong war. As the first wave of denial collapsed, Soviet analysts clung to a second lifeline: Iraqi operator error. Maybe the weapons weren't the problem. Maybe the Iraqis simply weren't using them properly. It was a comforting idea. Familiar. Blame the student, not the system. Soviet instructors had trained thousands of foreign crews over decades, from Egypt to Angola, Vietnam to Iraq. And while many proved competent, few matched Soviet standards for tactical integration, target prioritization, or real-time fire coordination. Iraq, they believed, was no different. Reports from the front lines, however, said otherwise. In the weeks leading up to Desert Storm, Soviet advisors had conducted rigorous refresher training across Iraq's key divisions. Radar batteries were drilled repeatedly. Mobile SAM crews rehearsed coordinated lock-ons. Field manuals were updated, fire zones plotted, overlapping coverage zones established. Soviet-made early warning radars had been repositioned to monitor flight corridors. This was not an untrained force. It was a Soviet-built, Soviet-taught air defense network manned by soldiers who knew the doctrine. And yet, the A-10s were flying through it, not around it, through it. One intercepted Iraqi report detailed how a Warthog made 3 passes over a tank column near Al-Kafji while under continuous Shilka fire. The crew swore they had registered hits. They saw sparks, smoke. But the jet continued its run, destroying 2 BMPs and escaping westward, trailing only vapor. Another crew near Nasiriyah fired an entire SA-9 battery, 4 missiles, at a pair of inbound A-10s. All missed. One A-10 returned 20 minutes later from a different angle and finished off a bridge convoy the missiles had failed to defend. If this was operator error, it was universal, which made the truth even more brutal. It wasn't a failure of training. It was a failure of assumption, the assumption that firepower always equaled lethality, that volume of fire replaced accuracy, that American aircraft were vulnerable because they were Western. But the A-10 had been designed from the outset to defy these rules. Its engines were mounted high to reduce heat signature and damage. Its avionics were ruggedized for shock. The airframe could take hits and stay structurally sound. The pilot sat inside a 200-pound titanium shell, proof against direct cannon fire. When a Shilka crew hit an A-10, they didn't down it. They woke it up. This was not the kind of airframe Soviet advisors had prepared for. They'd trained Iraqis to fight Mirages, Phantoms, and fast bombers that turned and ran after a single pass. But the Warthog turned back, over and over, as one shaken Iraqi battery commander radioed after a failed engagement. "It is not a plane. It is a curse." In Moscow, the truth became inescapable. Their system wasn't being misused. It was being outclassed. And soon the full scale of that failure would be exposed by a string of intelligence reports no one could argue with. By mid-February 1991, the Soviet military intelligence community had run out of excuses. The pattern was too consistent, the damage reports too detailed, the after-action videos too damning. The A-10 wasn't an anomaly. It was a known quantity. And Soviet intelligence had failed to recognize its true nature. The mistake hadn't begun in Baghdad. It began years earlier in the briefings and blueprints compiled by GRU analysts in Moscow. Intelligence reports had listed the A-10 as a low-speed, short-range ground attack aircraft with limited survivability against high-volume air defense fire. In short, a slow target. But that assessment had been based on conventional assumptions, principally that aircraft must rely on speed and altitude to avoid death. The A-10 was never built on that logic. And yet the Soviet intelligence apparatus had slotted it into a folder next to Vietnam-era Sky Raiders and light bombers. They had watched NATO exercises, catalogued airshow footage, reviewed performance specs, and failed to see the design for what it was: a flying contradiction. Even as A-10s made repeated runs into fortified kill zones, analysts clung to obsolete models. One internal document, later leaked to American sources, rated the Warthog as effective only against unarmored formations in uncontested airspace. That document was published in January 1991. The same week, A-10s destroyed over 50 armored vehicles in a single day. Now, as the war progressed, Soviet analysts had to revise in real time. Signal intercepts confirmed that Warthogs had been hit and kept flying. Thermal images showed entire divisions of Iraqi armor reduced to molten wreckage by low-altitude cannon-driven strikes. And worse, POW interrogations revealed that Iraqi tank crews feared A-10s more than any other aircraft. Not F-16s, not B-52s, not stealth bombers, the Warthog. A plane mocked for its looks, underestimated for its speed, and dismissed for decades. Now the most feared threat in the skies over Kuwait and southern Iraq. But intelligence failure wasn't just tactical, though. It was strategic. Because the Soviet Union had exported not just weapons, but a belief system. That layered, radar-guided defenses were invincible. That mobile missile batteries combined with radar-tracked guns would create kill zones no aircraft could enter. And that belief, embedded in doctrines, strategies, and alliances, had been shattered. Captured audio of Iraqi officers painted the picture. "We shot it. It flew. We shot it again. It killed us." There was no jamming, no stealth, no secret shield, just design, engineering, and a ruthless focus on one mission: kill tanks, no matter what's shooting back. In the weeks that followed, the damage became a scoreboard. A-10s had flown over 8,000 sorties, destroyed more than 900 tanks, 1,200 artillery pieces, and over 2,000 military vehicles, and fewer than 10 were lost. In any Soviet war game, those numbers were impossible, but now they were real, and the Soviet intelligence failure wasn't just a miss, it was a doctrinal collapse. To understand why the A-10 survived, and why it dismantled Soviet doctrine, one must understand the system that built it, not just the aircraft, but the doctrine, the culture, and the war that forged it. The A-10 was born in the wreckage of Vietnam. American air power had failed to stop convoys on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Fast jets, flying high and dropping bombs from altitude, couldn't hit tanks under jungle canopies. Close air support was disorganized, unreliable, and deadly for the troops who depended on it. So the Pentagon did something rare. It listened to soldiers. Infantry demanded a plane that wouldn't abandon them. A plane that could loiter, take fire, stay close, deliver precise, brutal firepower on armored targets without vanishing after one pass. In 1973, the answer arrived, the AX program. Fairchild Republic I, and the A-10 Thunderbolt II was born. From the start, it was ugly by design. Every curve, bolt, and rivet served a purpose. The twin turbofans were mounted high to avoid foreign object damage and reduce infrared signatures. The engines were separated to prevent a single hit from destroying both. The landing gear was rugged and spaced for rough airfields. And at the heart of it all, the GAU-8A Avenger, a 30mm 7-barrel cannon that weighed more than a Volkswagen Beetle. It fired uranium-tipped rounds capable of penetrating tank armor from over a mile away. The plane could fire 3,900 rounds per minute, each shell traveling faster than sound. But the gun wasn't an attachment. The plane was built around it. That mentality extended everywhere. The cockpit was surrounded by 1,200 pounds of titanium armor. The fuel tanks were inerted and foam-lined. The controls were double and triple redundant, with manual reversion for when hydraulics failed. The Warthog didn't fear being hit. It planned for it. But the aircraft alone wasn't what crushed Soviet expectations. It was the doctrine behind it. In the U.S. Air Force, the A-10 didn't operate in isolation. It was paired with J-STARS for battlefield surveillance. AWACS aircraft fed it real-time targeting. Combat search and rescue units stood by to retrieve downed pilots within minutes. It flew with a human network that turned firepower into precision. And perhaps most critically, it was trusted by the troops on the ground. No aircraft in U.S. history has earned more respect from infantry than the A-10. Marines called it the Angel of Death. Army units called it Heaven's Hammer. Its presence over the battlefield was more than tactical. It was psychological. When A-10s circled above, soldiers knew help was coming. Tanks would burn. and the enemy would run. That trust shaped how the Warthog was deployed. It wasn't held back. It wasn't protected from risk. It was sent into the most dangerous sectors first, to break lines, crush armor, and scatter formations. By contrast, Soviet doctrine treated aircraft as expendable but fragile. It valued standoff range, high speed, and radar guidance. Survivability meant not being hit. The A-10 made a different gamble, that it could take the hit and kill anyway. Soviet generals never accounted for that. Their systems weren't built to outlast that kind of stubbornness, and their soldiers weren't trained to fight an aircraft that didn't retreat. In the skies over Iraq, the A-10 didn't just win battles, it rewrote the rules, because America hadn't just built a plane. It had built a system of design, doctrine, and resolve that could break the Soviet model from the inside out. And it worked. February 25, 1991, southwest of Basra. A column of Iraqi armor, reinforced with artillery and mobile anti-air units, was retreating north from the Saudi border. Soviet advisors had helped design the route, ensuring overlapping coverage from ZSU-23-4s, SA-13 Gophers, and fixed radar systems. On paper, it was a fortress on wheels. Anything from the air would be torn apart long before it reached firing distance. Then came the growl, low, mechanical, familiar. The A-10s had arrived. A flight of 4 Warthogs from the 354th Tactical Fighter Wing began their attack from the south, flying nap of the earth to avoid early radar locks. Iraqi gunners spotted them too late. The lead Shilka opened fire, sending red tracer lines across the sky. A missile launched from a Gopher battery veered off as flares bloomed from the A-10's wings. Then came the counterattack. The GAU-8 thundered. In a few seconds, the forward tank platoon vanished in smoke and shrapnel. APCs burst like overfilled cans. Troops scrambled, abandoning vehicles, firing desperately into the sky with small arms. One A-10 was hit. A 23mm shell smashed into the right engine cowling. The turbine caught fire. Warning lights exploded in the cockpit. But the pilot, trained for this moment, activated the fire suppression system and throttled back. The Warthog didn't turn away. It circled. On the second pass, the wounded A-10 shredded a command vehicle and disabled a radar trailer. Its wingman struck a fuel truck, igniting a fireball that consumed half the convoy. By the time it ended, the battlefield was unrecognizable. Over 60 vehicles destroyed. Multiple APOA sites silenced. 0 American aircraft lost. CNN footage the next day showed the aftermath. Burned-out hulks scattered across the highway, shattered barrels, smoldering tank shells. The only sound, the buzz of wind over wreckage. In Baghdad, Soviet advisors were speechless. The weapon systems they had designed, trained, and exported had not just failed. They had been erased. One colonel reportedly asked, "Where are the wrecks of their aircraft?" No one had an answer. Worse still, the A-10 that had taken the engine hit made it back to base. Barely. It landed with one engine offline, half a stabilizer missing, and a wing trailing smoke. Mechanics needed 2 days to patch the damage. But the pilot was fine. The jet flew again 3 days later. For Soviet military leaders, this wasn't just a battlefield loss, it was a public defeat. Their most trusted export systems, defenses marketed to the entire Warsaw Pact and beyond, had been defeated by a slow American aircraft flying beneath the radar and above the fear. This wasn't theoretical anymore. It was filmed, broadcast, archived. And it forced a reckoning. If Soviet-designed air defense systems couldn't stop the A-10 in Iraq, how could they ever stop it over Europe? How could the Red Army's armored spearheads survive when NATO had a jet that hunted tanks like a predator in open country, and kept flying even after taking hits? These were no longer questions for training manuals. They were the death knell for the myth of Soviet air defense superiority. And every flaming T-72 the A-10 left behind made that truth harder to ignore. By the war's final week, the evidence had crushed every remaining Soviet illusion. Not in combat simulations, not in classified studies, but on television screens across the world. The A-10 had done something no Western aircraft was supposed to be able to do. It had survived, fought, and won in the exact combat environment that Soviet doctrine called impenetrable. And it had done so not once, but thousands of times. The collapse was more than tactical. It was ideological. The Soviet air defense model had been a pillar of Warsaw Pact military philosophy. From East Germany to Vietnam, Soviet planners taught that layered, integrated anti-air networks would dominate the battlefield. Guns, missiles, and mobile radars working together, an iron web no pilot could penetrate. But the A-10 hadn't just penetrated it had picked it apart. Strike after strike, sortie after sortie, the Warthog bypassed radar locks, shrugged off cannon fire, and delivered pinpoint strikes on tanks, artillery, and armored columns. Its mere presence changed Iraqi behavior. Units abandoned positions, convoys scattered, and commanders hesitated to deploy armor in daylight. This wasn't the effect of stealth. It was the effect of fear. Because the A-10 didn't vanish into the clouds like a bomber. It didn't fly high and drop from safety. It came low, it loitered, it watched. And then, with a cannon designed to kill tanks, it struck with surgical brutality, and still came back for more. The Soviet leadership realized too late that their doctrine had a fatal blind spot. They had optimized for intercepting fast bombers and high-altitude reconnaissance planes, but they had no counter for an aircraft that didn't play by those rules. In internal assessments following the war, the USSR quietly began reviewing its export strategy. How many of their allies, Vietnam, Syria, North Korea, were now relying on these same invincible air defense systems? How many would fall apart the moment an American Warthog appeared? The Cold War wasn't over yet in early 1991, but the strategic writing was already on the wall. Because if one American aircraft flying under 400 knots, low to the ground, and armored like a bank vault, could dismantle the myth of Soviet air superiority, then what did that say about the rest of the Soviet system? It didn't just signal a gap in weapons. It exposed a crack in the foundation of an empire's military faith. Today, the A-10 Thunderbolt II still flies. Decades after the Cold War ended, after the Soviet Union collapsed, and after most of its contemporaries were sent to boneyards, the Warthog remains in the air, ugly, loud, and unkillable. It's not because of nostalgia. It's because it works. Every time the United States has gone to war, Kosovo, Iraq again, Afghanistan, Syria, the A-10 has followed. Pilots call it the most trusted jet in the inventory. Ground troops call it the plane that saves lives. Enemies call it something else. The plane that doesn't die. And that's what makes it more than just an aircraft. The A-10 became the ghost that still haunts Soviet doctrine. Even after the Soviet Union disintegrated, even after the archives opened and war planners moved on, the failure of their air defense systems during Desert Storm remained a bitter lesson. Manuals were rewritten, export strategies revised. But the core wound, that a low and slow American jet had humiliated their best hardware, never healed. Ironically, the Americans themselves debated retiring the A-10 more than their enemies ever could. Generals questioned whether a subsonic, non-stealth aircraft had a place in modern warfare. Budgets tightened. Jets like the F-35 rose to prominence. But every time the A-10 faced the axe, combat realities forced a stay of execution. Because there are still tanks to kill, still convoys to intercept, and still soldiers on the ground who look up when they hear that growl and know they are not alone. The A-10 wasn't just a machine. It was a rebuttal, a middle finger to fragility, a thunderous declaration that sometimes the best way to win isn't to dodge every hit, but to survive every one of them. And for those who watched it carve burning trails across the Iraqi desert in 1991, especially Soviet generals who once believed their systems were unbeatable, the memory of the Warthog never fades, because it didn't just survive their guns. It flew through them, and turned their doctrine into dust.